The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of snow that promised quiet, cozy months ahead. It was a declaration of war. The cold did not knock before it entered. It shattered the flimsy locks of civility and kicked in the door. It was a physical presence, a predator that stalked the vast open plains, and every settler's cabin was a fragile fortress under siege. The wind was its scout, a relentless whisper that found every crack in the chinking, every gap in the window frames, and drove a sliver of ice straight into the heart of a room. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence, the battle was a familiar one, but this year felt different. The cold had come earlier and with more teeth. The log cabins, built with the pride and sweat of honest men, stood as dark shapes against an endless sea of white. They were symbols of defiance, of man's will carved into the wilderness. But they were failing. Inside, families huddled around cast-iron stoves that glowed a menacing red, devouring seasoned oak and poplar at a terrifying rate. The heat they produced was a fleeting thing, a desperate offering that shot straight up the stone chimneys and vanished into the gray, unforgiving sky. For every log thrown on the fire, a dozen drafts of Arctic air seemed to seep in as a replacement. Frost didn't just paint the window panes, it crawled down the interior walls in thick, fungal blooms of ice. Water buckets froze solid a few feet from the hearth. The old-timers, men who had faced down blizzards and droughts, spoke in low tones. They said the land was testing them, culling the weak. But their words were just a thin blanket against a cold that felt personal, a cold that seemed to want them gone. Every family felt the losing struggle. Woodpiles that were meant to last until March were already half gone by December. The sound of coughing echoed from cabin to cabin, a grim chorus of the sickness that thrived in the damp, uneven temperatures. They were doing what they had always done, what their fathers had taught them. They built strong walls from the straightest timber. They chinked with mud and moss. They built great, roaring fireplaces that could swallow a man's arm. And yet it was not enough. The cold was a patient thief, and it was stealing their warmth, their health, and their hope, one shivering night at a time. Amidst this shared, quiet desperation lived Ilara. She was a widow, a figure often seen at the edge of the community's vision, never at its center. Her husband, Anders, had been an engineer from the old country, a man of quiet thoughts and precise hands who had succumbed to a fever 2 summers prior. He had been different, a man who saw the world not just as it was, but in how it worked, in the flow of air, the transfer of heat, the unseen forces that governed their lives. He left behind his tools, a few precious books filled with strange diagrams, and his quiet, observant wife with their 2 small children, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Lena. Ilara was seen as fragile, a woman ill-suited for the brutalities of the frontier. The community watched her with a mixture of pity and concern. They expected her to fail, to pack up and return east, or to be taken in by another family. But Ilara possessed a resilience that was as quiet and deep as the winter frost. It was not a strength of muscle, but of observation. She had watched the wind strip the heat from her own small cabin. She had felt the icy floor beneath her feet even as the stove burned hot enough to warp the air above it. She had measured the wood she used and knew, with the stark clarity of mathematics, that they would not survive the winter if she continued as everyone else did. One morning, after a night spent feeding their stove every hour, listening to the wind howl like a hungry wolf, she made a decision. She pulled out one of Anders's old, leather-bound books. The text was in a language she could not read, but the drawings were universal. They showed structures that were not tall and proud, but low and embedded in the earth. They showed fires that were not large and open, but small and enclosed within massive stone hearts. They showed smoke that did not rush up a chimney, but that snaked through long, winding channels built inside the very walls and floors of the home. The idea was radical, a complete rejection of everything she saw around her. It was a shelter that did not fight the cold, but absorbed and tamed it. The next day, the settlers saw a strange sight. Ilara was not chopping more wood or re-chinking her cabin. She was on the south-facing side of a low hill behind her property, marking a large rectangle in the frozen dirt with a pickaxe. With her were Samuel and Lena, their small hands wrapped in rags, helping to clear loose stones. She was digging. Not a root cellar, not a well, but what looked like the foundation for a new home. But it was a hole, a pit in the earth. Thomas was the first to approach. He was the settlement's most respected builder, a broad-shouldered man whose hands had shaped half the cabins in Providence. He was a man of tradition, of proven methods. He stood at the edge of the hole she was digging, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of profound confusion on his face. "What is this, Ilara?" he asked, his voice not unkind, but heavy with authority. "Winter is here. This is no time for digging holes." Ilara paused, leaning on her shovel, her breath a white cloud in the frigid air. "I am building a new shelter, Thomas," she said simply. "The cabin will not keep us." Thomas squinted, trying to understand. "A shelter? In the ground? That's a soddy. A temporary measure for folks with nothing better. You have a good log cabin. The walls are sound." He pointed to her existing home. "You just need a bigger stove, more wood." "A bigger stove will burn more wood faster," she replied, her voice steady. "It will not warm the floor. It will not stop the wind." She pointed to the drawings she had laid out on a flat rock, weighted down against the breeze. "The earth will be my north wall. The walls will hold the heat, not let it escape." He glanced at the strange diagrams, the arrows showing the flow of smoke through channels in the walls. He saw no grand chimney, only a small vent low to the ground. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pity. "Ilara," he said, shaking his head, "you can't live in a smokehouse. A fire needs to breathe. It needs a chimney to draw. Without a proper flue, you'll fill this hole with smoke and soot. You'll suffocate your own children. This is foolishness. It's book madness." Word of the widow's folly spread through the settlement like a winter fever. Men would stop by on their way to hunt or check their traps, leaning on their rifles and offering unsolicited advice. They called it Ilara's gopher hole. They laughed, not with malice, but with the condescending certainty of men who knew the right way to do things. "The damp will get in your bones," one warned. "The roof will collapse under the first heavy snow," another predicted. The women were gentler, but no less skeptical. They brought her hot broth and bread, their eyes filled with worry for her and the children. They saw her not as an innovator, but as a woman undone by grief, clinging to the strange ideas of her dead husband. Their mockery was a constant, low hum in the background of her work, another cold wind to endure. But Ilara did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply worked. Every day, from the first gray light of dawn until the purple dusk fell, she dug. The frozen earth fought back, yielding only inches at a time. Her hands, soft from a life spent indoors, became calloused, then cracked and bled. Samuel and Lena, seeing their mother's unwavering determination, worked alongside her. They hauled away buckets of dirt, gathered stones from the creek bed, their small faces set with a seriousness that belied their years. They were a tiny, isolated crew, working on an arc of earth against a coming flood of ice. The physical labor was immense. After digging the rectangular pit 7 feet deep into the hillside, she began the walls. She did not use logs. She used the earth itself. She cut bricks of sod from the prairie, the thick roots of buffalo grass, holding them together. She laid them grass side down, building up the 3 exposed walls, layer by layer. Between each layer of sod, she packed a thick insulation of dried prairie grass she and the children had spent the late summer gathering. It was a slow, painstaking process. Each sod brick had to be perfectly placed, each layer of insulation evenly spread. At the center of the structure, she began to build the heart. It was not a fireplace. It was a massive, complex construction of flat stones and clay, a masonry heater like the ones in Anders' book. It had a small firebox at the bottom, but above it was a labyrinth of channels, a maze designed to trap the heat from the smoke. From this central mass, she built more channels that snaked through the floor and up through the thick earthen walls. It was like building the arteries of a living thing, a system designed to circulate warmth to every part of the home. This was the part the others could not comprehend. "The smoke will crack the walls," Thomas had warned her, stopping by again. "You're building a bomb." She simply nodded and continued fitting the stones together, her movements precise and patient. While Elara toiled in her pit, the rest of the community continued with their own winter preparations. Thomas was supervising the construction of a new cabin for a family that had arrived late in the season. They worked with impressive speed and skill. Great logs were notched and fitted, the gaps stuffed with moss and smeared with a thick daub of clay and grass. They raised a massive stone chimney on the west wall, a proud tower that stood tall against the sky. It was a testament to their way of life, to their strength and know-how. They finished it in under 2 weeks, and the whole settlement gathered for a housewarming, the fire roaring in the new hearth, the laughter and talk a warm bubble in the cold air. From her hill, Elara could hear them. She could see the plume of smoke rising from their new chimney, a thick, dark column of wasted heat, and she just kept working. Her work was slow, methodical, and often lonely. The sun, a pale disk in the winter sky, offered little warmth. Her muscles ached with a deep, persistent pain. There were moments of doubt, dark hours in the dead of night when the laughter of the others echoed in her mind. Was she a fool? Was she endangering her children, chasing a phantom from a book? She would look at Samuel and Lena, sleeping fitfully in the cold cabin, their breath visible in the air, and her resolve would harden like frozen steel. She was not building out of fancy, but out of necessity. She was not following a dream. She was following the laws of heat and mass, laws that Anders had understood. She laid thick timbers over the top of the structure, leaving a small opening for a window and another for a door. Over the timbers, she layered more sod, creating a living roof that was nearly 3 feet thick. She built a sturdy door and fitted it with a single pane of glass she had salvaged. The final piece of the puzzle was the flue exit. It was not a chimney. It was a small, stone-lined opening on the eastern wall, protected by a flat rock to keep out snow. It looked like nothing more than a drainage pipe. The entire structure was low, unassuming, its roof barely rising above the crest of the hill. From a distance, it almost disappeared into the landscape. It did not stand in defiance of the prairie. It nestled into it, as if it had grown there. By the time she finished, the first great storm was on the horizon. The sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. The air grew still and heavy, a silence that was more menacing than any wind. The animals knew. The rabbits stayed in their warrens. The coyotes fell silent. The settlers knew too. They double-checked their woodpiles, boarded up their windows, and brought their livestock into the barns. They looked at Elara's finished mound on the hill and shook their heads one last time. Thomas, seeing her bank a small, modest fire in her strange new stove, felt a pang of genuine pity. He resolved to check on her after the storm passed, to bring the widow and her children to a proper house before they froze. Then the storm hit. It did not arrive. It descended. It was a white hurricane, a solid wall of wind and snow that erased the world. The sky and the earth merged into a single churning vortex of white. The wind was not a sound, it was a physical blow, a battering ram that slammed against the cabins. It screamed, it shrieked, it clawed at the walls, seeking entry. The temperature plummeted. It dropped 10, then 20, then 30 degrees in a matter of hours. Metal became brittle enough to snap. A breath of exposed air felt like a burn. Inside the log cabins of Providence, the battle turned into a rout. The wind, like a relentless army, found every weakness. It blasted the chinking out from between the logs. It forced its way through keyholes and under doors, carrying with it a fine, penetrating dust of snow that coated everything in a layer of white. The mighty fireplaces became traitors. The fiercer the wind blew outside, the more powerfully the chimneys drew, sucking the precious warm air out of the rooms and pulling in drafts of glacial cold to replace it. Families were forced into a single room, huddled together under every blanket they owned. They burned wood with a frantic, desperate energy, but the cabins only grew colder. The walls leached warmth, radiating a deep, penetrating chill. Thomas, in his own well-built home, watched in horror as a cup of water on the table, 10 feet from his roaring fire, began to film over with ice. He could feel the cold seeping up from the floorboards, a tangible enemy rising from the ground itself. The new cabin he had just built was even worse. The green wood of the logs had shrunk in the intense cold, opening up new gaps for the wind to exploit. The family inside was in mortal danger. The promise of the proud chimney had been a lie. But on the hill, in the burrow of earth, there was stillness. The wind howled over the low, curved roof, unable to find purchase. It was like water flowing over a smooth stone. Inside Ilara's shelter, there was no sound of the storm, only a deep, profound silence. The thick earthen walls, insulated and protected by the hill itself, did not feel the wind's assault. Hours earlier, Ilara had lit a small fire in the masonry stove, using only a few pieces of seasoned wood. The fire had burned hot and fast, and then it had gone out. But its work was not done. The immense heat it had generated was now trapped within the stone and clay mass of the stove and the winding flues. That heat now radiated slowly, steadily, into the room. It was not a blast of hot air from a single point. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that came from all directions at once. The floor was warm to the touch. The walls were warm. The air was still and calm, holding a steady, comfortable temperature. Lena and Samuel were not huddled in blankets. They were sleeping peacefully in their small beds, their faces flushed with warmth. Ilara sat at her small table, mending a sock by the light of a single candle, the utter silence of her shelter a stark contrast to the screaming chaos of the world outside. The system had worked. The heat had stayed in the walls. The blizzard raged for 3 days. For 3 days, the world was an abyss of white. When the wind finally subsided and the snow stopped falling, a new landscape was revealed. Providence was buried. The cabins were monstrous drifts of snow, their roofs barely visible. Paths had vanished. The world was remade in soft, silent, deadly mounds. A desperate quiet fell over the settlement, the quiet of exhaustion and fear. The first man to emerge was Jacob, Ilara's closest neighbor. His woodpile was gone, burned away in the futile fight against the cold. His children were sick, his wife's face pale with exhaustion. He needed more wood, but his shed was buried under a 10-foot drift. He remembered Ilara. A terrible thought seized him, the widow and her children, alone in that strange hole. They must have frozen. He had to check. He began the grueling work of digging his way out, the snow a heavy, wet blanket. It took him an hour to flounder the 100 yards to her hill. He saw no sign of life. The structure was almost completely buried, a gentle swelling in the snow. There was no smoke, no sign of a fire. His heart sank. He had been right. The foolish woman had killed them all. He stumbled toward the door, preparing himself for the grim sight within. As he drew closer, he noticed something strange. A small, circular patch of snow near the edge of the roof was melted away, revealing the green sod beneath. And from a low vent on the side of the mound, a faint, almost invisible wisp of steam curled into the frigid air. It was not smoke, it was just warmth. He reached the door and knocked, his knuckles numb. There was a shuffling sound, and the door opened. Ilara stood there, her face calm. Behind her, in the soft candlelight, he saw her children playing quietly on the floor with wooden toys. They were not wearing coats. A wave of warmth washed over him, so shocking and alien that he staggered back. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a stove, but a deep, gentle warmth that seemed to come from the very air, the floor, the walls. He looked past her, into the small, quiet room. He saw no fire, only the dark stone of the central hearth, which was warm to the touch. He saw no shivering, no frost on the walls, no fear. He saw only peace. He looked at Ilara, then at his own freezing, desperate state, and he could not speak. Before he could find his voice, another figure appeared, struggling through the deep drifts. It was Thomas. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped with the weight of failure. His own family was safe, but freezing. The new cabin he had built had become a tomb of ice. He had spent the morning digging the family out, bringing them to his own overcrowded hearth. He had come to Ilara's expecting the worst, to perform the grim duty of rescuing her children from their mother's folly. He saw Jacob standing at the open door, his face a mask of disbelief. And then he, too, felt it. The impossible, steady warmth emanating from the hole in the ground. Thomas pushed past Jacob and stepped inside. The air was warm and still. He looked at the children, sleeping soundly. He ran a hand along the smooth clay wall. It was radiating heat like a sun-baked stone. He looked at the floor, at the central stove, at the utter simplicity and overwhelming success of the room. He saw the faint wisp of vapor rising from the flue outside the window. And finally, he understood. The smoke wasn't meant to escape. It was meant to stay, to travel, to give up its lifeblood of heat to the mass of the house before it was allowed to die in the cold air outside. All the heat he had been sending up his chimney, all that wasted energy, she had captured it. She had woven it into the fabric of her home. He turned to Ilara. The pride was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, humbling awe. He, the master builder, the man of tradition and know-how, had been wrong. So profoundly, dangerously wrong. He had built a sieve designed to leak heat, while she, the quiet widow with her strange books, had built a vessel designed to hold it. He thought of the laughter, the warnings, the condescending smiles. He felt a hot flush of shame that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. She saw the exhaustion and defeat in his eyes, and simply gestured to a small wooden stool. "Come in, Thomas," she said, her voice soft. "Sit. I will make some tea." The offer was a simple act of hospitality, but in that moment, it was an act of profound grace. It was forgiveness. Word spread as if carried on the wind. As more settlers dug themselves out, they saw the activity around Ilara's mound. They saw Jacob hauling his family over, their faces pinched with cold, and saw them disappear into the earth. They saw Thomas, the builder, emerge an hour later, his expression one of a man who had seen a miracle. One by one, families made the pilgrimage to the widow's strange home. Each one stopped at the door, stunned by the wave of warmth. Each one stepped inside and fell silent, taking in the scene of impossible comfort. The children, whose houses were frozen prisons, stared at Samuel and Lena playing in their shirt sleeves. The men, whose hands were raw from chopping and hauling wood, looked at Alara's small, neat woodpile and could not reconcile it with the gentle climate inside. Her home became a sanctuary. She took in 2 other families, her small space becoming crowded, but remaining effortlessly warm. The laughter that had once been directed at her was gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent respect. They looked at her not as a foolish woman, but as a prophet. They saw not a hole in the ground, but a womb of safety and life in the midst of a dead, frozen world. The mockery had died, and in its place, humility was beginning to take root. A week after the storm, Thomas returned. He did not come with others. He came alone. He carried not a loaf of bread or a side of venison, but a piece of slate and a nub of charcoal. He stood in her doorway, his hat in his hands, and he did not ask to come in. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire life's experience. "My pride nearly cost people their lives. What I know is not enough." He held up the slate. "Teach me," he said. "Teach me how you did this." And so she did. She shared everything. She brought out Anders's books, and, though she could not read the words, she pointed to the diagrams, tracing the path of the smoke with her finger. She explained the principles as she understood them, that earth holds warmth better than air, that a slow release of heat is better than a fast one, that a chimney is a hole you build in your roof to let the warmth out. She drew on his slate, showing him the cross-section of the walls, the layers of sod and grass. She explained thermal mass, not in the language of engineers, but in the language of a baker. "The stove is the oven," she said. "You heat it once, hot and fast. Then the stones become the heat. They bake the room all day long." Thomas became her most devoted student. He sat on the warm floor of her home for hours, sketching, asking questions, his builder's mind slowly unwinding the old rules and weaving in the new ones. He was not just learning a new technique, he was learning a new way of seeing the world. He began to understand the prairie not as an enemy to be conquered with sharp axes and tall cabins, but as a partner to be understood and embraced. The earth was not just dirt, it was insulation. The hill was not an obstacle, it was a wall. The cold was not a foe to be fought, it was a force to be redirected. That spring, a profound change came over the settlement of Providence. As the great mounds of snow melted away, revealing a landscape scoured and humbled by the winter, the work began. But they were not felling trees for new log cabins. Led by Thomas, the men of the settlement gathered on the hillsides. With Alara as their quiet guide, they began to dig. They worked together, a community reborn not in pride, but in shared purpose. Thomas, once the master, was now the foreman of a new philosophy, directing the placement of stones for the masonry heaters, explaining the critical importance of the winding flues. The landscape of the settlement began to change. Instead of the sharp, angular lines of log cabins, low, soft, organic shapes began to emerge from the earth. They built into the south-facing slopes, embracing the low winter sun. They cut sod and laid it with care. They built the complex hearts of stone and clay, their hands moving with the confidence of newfound wisdom. The women and children gathered the dried grasses for insulation, their movements part of a communal rhythm of survival. There was no mockery now, only collaboration. They were not just building shelters, they were building a future. The story of Providence and its strange, warm houses began to travel. A surveyor passing through that summer saw the new village and was baffled. He saw homes with no chimneys, yet he saw people thriving. He stayed for a week, listening to the story of the great blizzard, of the widow's folly that became their salvation. He sketched the designs on paper and carried the story with him to the east. The tale was retold in forts and land offices, in newspapers and letters home. The idea of the chimneyless house spread, a quiet revolution of common sense, carried by people who had learned a hard lesson from the land itself. Ilara never sought credit. She remained a quiet member of the community, her life defined not by the single brilliant act of survival, but by the steady, daily rhythms of raising her children. Yet she was forever changed in the eyes of her neighbors. She was no longer the fragile widow, but a wellspring of quiet wisdom. They sought her advice not just on building, but on all manner of things, for they had learned that the most profound truths are often hidden in the simplest forms, and that true strength is not loud and defiant, but quiet, patient, and deeply rooted. Years later, as the settlement grew and prospered, the original log cabins stood as solemn reminders of the winter that had almost broken them. They were used as barns and sheds, their tall, proud chimneys crumbling, symbols of a prideful ignorance they had thankfully outgrown. The new homes, nestled into the earth, remained. They were proof that survival was not about fighting the world, but about understanding it. The greatest lesson of that terrible winter was not in the cleverness of a new design, but in the humility required to accept it. It was the knowledge that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to listen to a quiet voice, to trust an unfamiliar idea, and to have the courage to admit that the old way is no longer the best way. The warmth that saved Providence came not from a roaring fire, but from a humble heart and an open mind.